In the vast and tumultuous expanse of the Warhammer 40k universe, the line between reality and madness often blurs. Across countless stars and uncountable lives, tales of ancient horrors and forbidden truths echo in hushed whispers. Among these stories, one name surfaces like a malign specter, the King in Yellow. Unlike the chaotic maelstrom of the Warp or the tangible threat of the Tyranids and Necrons, this entity defies categorization, existing in a realm where perception itself becomes the battlefield. To speak of the King in Yellow is to tread on treacherous ground. It is not merely a being or a force. It is an enigma that permeates through forbidden texts, cursed relics, and minds stretched beyond the brink of reason. His presence is subtle, insidious, and infinitely more dangerous because of the intangible nature of his influence. Scholars of the Ordo Malleus have debated whether the entity is an extension of the Chaos Gods, an independent force, or something altogether more alien, an infection of reality itself. The universe of Warhammer 40k thrives on conflict, but the King in Yellow introduces a different kind of peril. His influence weaves through the fabric of belief, art, and expression, transforming them into conduits for despair and corruption. Where his shadow falls, empires falter, and even the most stalwart minds crumble. Those who encounter even a fragment of his essence find themselves ensnared in a narrative of their own unraveling, a story they cannot escape, and one that perhaps they were always destined to tell. This tale is not one of grand armies clashing or titanic machines warring across void-struck worlds. It is a story of subtleties, of whispers that echo in silence, of symbols that burn into memory, and of a cursed play that binds its readers to a fate worse than death. It is a narrative that slips past fortresses and armor, cutting directly into the soul of its victims. To understand the King in Yellow is to accept that some truths are better left unknown. His is a legend that begins in shadow, thrives in secrecy, and leaves ruin in its wake. But this shadowed tale, this forbidden chronicle, is more than a mere story. It is a puzzle that entangles the Imperium, the Eldar, and even the forces of chaos in a web of lies and half-truths. And at the center of it all lies the King, cloaked in the tattered remnants of a forgotten cosmos, waiting for the day when his true influence will be known. For now we stand at the precipice, daring to glance into the abyss. What lies beyond this veil is not a question of courage, but of survival. Prepare yourself, for what follows is a journey into the heart of madness, a tale of unraveling realities, and the terrifying truth behind the King in Yellow. The King in Yellow is more than a figure. He is a presence that transcends the boundaries of sanity and space. To understand the key players within his narrative is to examine a mosaic of fragments, each bound by threads of fate that intertwine with his terrifying mythos. At the heart of this tangled web stands the King himself, shrouded in tattered robes of shifting hues that seem to bleed into the air around him. He is neither mortal nor fully comprehensible, a force defined not by his actions but by the changes he inflicts upon those who glimpse his veiled form. His appearance marks the crumbling of reason, the death of hope, and the slow unraveling of the mind. The King's influence is not merely his own doing, it is spread through objects, relics, and symbols imbued with his essence. Chief among these is the Accursed Play, a forbidden work whose verses worm their way into the thoughts of anyone who dares to read them. The play acts as a gateway, a subtle invitation for the King's influence to spread, drawing in those who are susceptible to his call. Whether the play was authored by mortal hands or something far more sinister is unknown, but its verses hold the same quiet malignance as the King himself. The Ordo Malleus, ever vigilant against threats to the soul of humanity, plays a critical role in the unfolding drama. Tasked with understanding and combating the unknowable, the inquisitors of this order are among the few willing to risk their sanity to unravel the mysteries of entities like the King. Despite their formidable resources, they walk a perilous path. For every inquisitor who resists the pull of the madness, another succumbs, becoming a broken whisper of who they once were or a fanatic obsessed with deciphering the meaning behind the king's influence. Alongside the Inquisition are the rogue scholars and collectors of forbidden knowledge who skirt the edges of the Imperium's strict edicts. Many of these individuals believe they can harness the secrets contained within the cursed play for their own purposes. Some seek power, others pursue answers to questions that should never have been asked. Whether motivated by hubris or genuine curiosity, they often become unwitting pawns in the king's narrative. Their findings are recorded in journals, locked away in vaults, or passed along in whispered rumors that spread like a contagion. Entire libraries have burned under orders to purge these dangerous accounts, but fragments inevitably survive. Another faction drawn into this dark tapestry is the ecclesiarchy. Driven by a deep-seated need to preserve the faith of mankind, its priests and zealots view the king as a blasphemous affront to the emperor's divine truth. Where others see enigmatic warnings, the ecclesiarchy sees heresy to be extinguished. Processions of warrior priests march with fury, burning texts, relics, and any who have been tainted by the king's presence. Yet their fanaticism often blinds them to the subtlety of the threat. Though they are resolute in their purpose, many lack the comprehension needed to grasp the true nature of what they face. The Eldar, ancient and haunted by their own catastrophic history, regard the King in Yellow as yet another manifestation of the universe's malevolent undercurrents. Their seers speak of shadowed timelines where empires crumble not through war, but through whispers that drive leaders to ruin. These warnings are treated with the same reverence as any dire prophecy, though even their wisdom may falter when confronted with an entity that defies their vast, though fragile, understanding of fate. Some among them whisper that the king is not bound to any known god or demon, but something older, something born of dreams and twisted stories. In the shadows of human society lurk cults devoted to the king in Yellow. Unlike the overtly destructive cults of the ruinous powers, these adherents often blend seamlessly into the masses. Their devotion takes the form of subtle sabotage, spread through art, theater, and whispered riddles that evoke unease rather than outright panic. Some of these cultists may not even be aware of their full allegiance, merely serving as vessels for the king's will, driven by compulsions they cannot explain. To them, the idea of free will is an illusion, and their actions are but scenes in a play already written. Finally, there are the lost souls, the broken remnants of those who once held positions of power and influence, but were undone by the king's influence. Nobles, warlords, and even entire planetary governors have fallen into ruin, their minds consumed by cryptic visions of a city that never was and a fate that cannot be avoided. These fallen figures become instruments of the king's influence, their ambitions reduced to a desperate need to reenact the roles they believe they were destined to play. Together, these participants form the tragic cast of a tale that spans both time and space, with each player unaware of the true scope of their involvement. Some believe they are the protagonists of their own stories, while others are resigned to the roles they have been forced to play. But all are bound by the same thread, a lingering question that haunts every act and every scene. When the final curtain falls, will they ever understand what truly lies behind the mask? Long before the name of the King in Yellow seeped into whispers across the galaxy, there was a meeting that defied the conventions of time and destiny, a moment that became the first note in a melody of unraveling fate. To understand how such an encounter came to pass, one must journey back to an era steeped in both ambition and chaos, when the Emperor of mankind walked among mortals, weaving the foundations of his grand vision for humanity. During the Unification Wars, the Emperor sought not only to conquer the divided warlords of Terra, but also to amass a retinue of exceptional individuals, those who could serve as his vanguard against the darkness encroaching on humanity's potential. Among the scholars, warriors, and visionaries drawn to the Emperor's cause, there were those whose brilliance lay beyond their era's comprehension. They were men and women of unparalleled genius or madness, capable of seeing possibilities that others could not fathom. Yet, It was in the pursuit of understanding the immaterial, the fabric of dreams, willpower, and thought, that the Emperor encountered something he had not anticipated. Legends speak of a figure who appeared during one of the Emperor's expeditions into the hidden places of Terra, where ancient ruins and vaults concealed forbidden histories. It was said to be a place where the barriers between worlds thinned, and visions of the past and future could linger like echoes. There, the Emperor encountered a man who spoke in riddles and poetry, whose presence seemed out of place even among the relics of old Terra. This man, clothed in robes unlike any worn by the peoples of the age, was no ordinary wanderer. The Emperor, despite his unmatched power and foresight, perceived something about this man that was both dangerous and intriguing. The man claimed to be an architect of narratives, an observer who could weave truth into fiction and fiction into reality. His words were laden with meanings that could shift depending on the listener's interpretation. What drew the Emperor's interest was not the man's origin, but the scope of his vision, his understanding of how belief could shape worlds and how fear could manifest as a tangible force. The man spoke of stories that could bind entire civilizations and of a stage upon which all of humanity unknowingly performed. Recognizing the potential utility of this man's insights, the Emperor allowed him to join his court. However, this was not a simple alliance born of trust. The Emperor's unmatched intellect led him to believe that he could harness even the most unpredictable of tools. He viewed the man as a necessary instrument in understanding the darker currents that lay beyond the material world. And for a time, the enigmatic figure walked alongside the greatest minds of the fledgling Imperium, advising on matters of cultural influence, morale, and the ways in which symbols and ideas could unite or fracture humanity. The man's teachings became valuable during the earliest stages of the Emperor's great project, particularly when it came to the formation of doctrines meant to inspire loyalty and unity. Yet, his methods often seemed strange, even unsettling. He would speak of stories that could implant visions in a person's dreams, of performances that could ignite emotions powerful enough to change the course of events. Some within the Emperor's inner circle grew wary of his influence, fearing that his counsel bordered on manipulation rather than inspiration. Over time, the man became known by a title rather than a name, a moniker whispered by those who felt unease in his presence. They called him the Yellow Sage, owing to the pale hue of his garb and the pervasive sense of decay that seemed to accompany him. Though his contributions shaped several pivotal moments in the early consolidation of humanity's dominion over Terra, shadows clung to every act he influenced. Whispers of peculiar tragedies followed in his wake. Leaders driven to madness after hearing his stories, entire legions of soldiers haunted by vivid nightmares after witnessing his strange performances of war chants and proclamations. Despite the rising unease, the Emperor refrained from casting him aside. Whether driven by a genuine belief in the man's value or a desire to better understand the danger he posed, the Emperor kept the Yellow Sage close, always observing, always calculating. Yet, this closeness became the very seed of disaster. It is said that at the height of one of Terra's final unification campaigns, the Yellow Sage presented the Emperor with a gift, a creation born from his peculiar talents. It was not a weapon or a relic, but a play, a written composition meant to encapsulate the triumph and tragedy of the human condition. The Emperor, driven by curiosity and perhaps a desire to test the depths of this man's knowledge, allowed his court to witness the performance of the play. What followed would become one of the earliest internal crises of the Emperor's rule. The performance was unlike anything the gathered audience had seen or heard. As the actors spoke their lines, a palpable shift seemed to fill the room, as though reality itself bent to accommodate the narrative unfolding before them. By the final act, many of those in attendance were reduced to tears, not by sorrow, but by a terrible comprehension of their own insignificance in the grand design of fate. Others, unable to bear the weight of the narrative, descended into madness. The Emperor ended the performance with a single command, silencing the stage with his mere presence. Though he would never speak of that moment again, it is said that something changed after that day. The Yellow Sage vanished from the Emperor's court, his name struck from records, his works erased from memory where possible. Yet, the ripple of his influence had already begun, a legacy of despair that would spread far beyond Terra, beyond the Emperor's sight, into the endless void. Thus, the tale of the King in Yellow began not with a coronation, but with a betrayal of trust disguised as art. Though he may have walked among the Emperor's chosen, his path diverged into the unknown, leaving behind unanswered questions and a story destined to ensnare far more than the minds of mere mortals. What followed was no longer within the grasp of logic, but a slow descent into the realm of forgotten dreams and forbidden truths. As the echoes of the past faded and the unification of Terra continued to reshape the world, the enigmatic figure known as the Yellow Sage drifted away from the Emperor's direct presence. Yet his absence did not signal the end of his influence. It marked the beginning of something far more insidious, a transformation hidden beneath layers of secrecy and forgotten records. While the Emperor's grand vision expanded into the stars, the legacy of the one who had been cast out began to coalesce into something that would haunt the Imperium long after those early days. Though erased from history's official chronicles, remnants of his path remained in fragments, reports from the early days of the Imperium that referenced an unseen hand guiding certain events. Imperial scholars, long after the fact, speculated that this shadowed figure moved in silence, still observing the rise of the Imperium and weaving stories that would ripple across history. But there was something more to his continued existence than mere exile. The man once known as the Yellow Sage had not faded into obscurity. He had become something else entirely. Amidst the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, the custodians of history, those rare few tasked with preserving the truth, kept their records sealed away. Among the countless tomes of forgotten knowledge, one name reappeared in whispers: Constantine Valdor. Valdor, the first Captain General of the Legio Custodes and one of the Emperor's most trusted, was a figure immortalized by his dedication and loyalty. To most, his name was synonymous with incorruptible strength, but few dared to contemplate the full extent of Valdor's story, one that did not end with victory, but with transformation. There are conflicting accounts of how Constantine Valdor, once the very embodiment of order and duty, found himself aligned with a power that defied reason. Some believed that his fall began not with ambition, but with revelation, a moment when he glimpsed the hidden cost of the Emperor's grand design. Perhaps it was not defiance that changed him, but despair. As Captain General, Valdor witnessed firsthand the cracks in humanity's foundation, the sacrifices made in the name of progress, and the quiet unraveling of ideals once thought unshakable. Valdor's unmatched mind made him more than a warrior. He was a strategist, a philosopher, and an interpreter of the Emperor's will. Yet, that very intellect made him susceptible to questions that should never have been asked. Accounts suggest that Valdor became obsessed with the concept of fate and free will, haunted by the idea that even the Emperor's grand vision was part of a larger narrative beyond their control. He turned to sources of knowledge that few others would dare approach, remnants of lost civilizations, forbidden texts sealed beneath the soil of long-dead cities, and visions born from sleepless nights spent within the echoing silence of the Imperial Palace. In time, the Yellow Sage became more than a title. It became a mask, a role taken on by Valdor as he began to view his place in the Emperor's vision as something far different from what he had once believed. He spoke less of protection and more of inevitability, using cryptic language that disturbed even his closest peers. Some of his most trusted custodians grew concerned, though none dared to question the Captain General directly. They knew him as a symbol of unyielding loyalty, unable to fathom that his perception of duty had shifted into something else entirely. What happened next remains a point of contention, but the result is undeniable. Valdor disappeared. Official records declared him lost during the tumultuous years leading up to the Horus Heresy, though the details of his final actions remain deliberately vague. Some whispered that he had ventured into the warp itself in search of answers. Others suggested that he had retreated to some forgotten corner of the galaxy, burdened by a knowledge too great to bear. But those who followed the trail of clues left behind in rare manuscripts and fragmented accounts began to see the outlines of a chilling truth. The identity of the Yellow Sage and Constantin Valdor became entwined, with both names serving as masks for something far greater, the entity that would later be known as the King in Yellow. No longer merely a man, Valdor's obsession with understanding the narrative threads of the universe had reshaped him into a being that transcended his former self. His teachings, once meant to fortify the Imperium, evolved into something far darker. Stories that did not inspire hope, but invited ruin. The play that bore his mark was not a creation meant to entertain or enlighten, but a tool to reveal the fragility of perception itself. Those who encountered him after his transformation did not see the resolute figure of the Captain General, clad in gold and bearing the Emperor's sigil. Instead, they saw a figure draped in decayed finery, his visage obscured by a mask that seemed to shift like a fevered memory. He no longer spoke in commands or battle hymns, but in verses that unsettled the soul. His arrival was not heralded by the clash of armor, but by the quiet descent of an unnatural calm, a silence broken only by words that planted seeds of doubt and despair. Valdor's journey from Captain General to the King in Yellow was not the tale of a warrior corrupted by ambition, but of a guardian undone by revelation. In seeking to understand the forces that shaped destiny, he had become a reflection of them, a being whose very presence blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Though his name may have been forgotten by those who served the Imperium, his shadow remained. His influence stretched across time and space, manifesting in stories whispered by frightened soldiers, in the madness of seers who glimpsed too far, and in the cursed pages of a play that promised answers but delivered only ruin. Thus, the story of Valdor's rise and fall became inseparable from the legend of the King in Yellow. Once the embodiment of loyalty and purpose, he had become a figure who embodied the unknowable, the subtle poison that crept into the heart of the Imperium and reminded all who heard his tale that even the brightest lights could cast the darkest shadows. And as his legend grew, so too did the questions surrounding his final fate. Was he truly lost, or had he simply taken his place on a different stage, preparing for the final act of a performance that began long before the Imperium's rise? The moment that reshaped the fate of the King in Yellow began with a choice, a divergence between what was once his sworn duty and the revelations that had consumed him. The fall of a monarch is rarely a single catastrophic blow, but a sequence of carefully orchestrated moments that culminate in ruin. Yet, in this narrative, there was one act that defined everything. Valdor's final refusal to stand as a silent guardian, and his decision to take on the role of an orchestrator of collapse. At the heart of this turning point lay a dying world, a distant planet whose leaders had long defied the Emperor's doctrine of unity. This world, though insignificant by most accounts, became the stage for one of the most symbolic conflicts of the era. The Emperor's armies had besieged the planet for years, unable to break its spirit. Resistance movements spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers of a leader who spoke of liberation through truth and despair. These messages were riddled with cryptic lines that some recognized as passages from the forbidden play, though few dared speak of it openly. Inquisitors and military officials alike were baffled by the effectiveness of this resistance. Reports spoke not of vast armies, but of isolated cells held together by an idea, a belief that the war they fought was not merely a physical struggle, but the reenactment of a story that had already been written. Their morale seemed unbreakable, driven by a conviction that they were fulfilling a purpose far greater than themselves. At the core of this belief was a figure who wore the trappings of ruin like a crown, a man who spoke in measured, poetic tones, his voice both familiar and alien. When the Imperial forces finally broke through the last lines of defense and reached the central citadel, they did not find a warlord awaiting judgment. Instead, they encountered a single throne, draped in faded yellow cloth, with inscriptions carved into the surrounding walls. These inscriptions were not warnings or prayers. They were lines from a narrative that resonated with all who read them. It was said that even the most hardened soldiers faltered as they took in the words, sensing that they had walked into a performance rather than a victory. Their triumph felt rehearsed, their every step a part of an unseen script. The revelation came too late. By the time the banners of the Imperium were raised, the seeds of uncertainty had been sown. The survivors who fled the ruined world spread tales of a monarch who had abandoned his throne but left behind a legacy of defiance. These stories painted the fallen ruler not as a tyrant, but as a tragic figure who had chosen to sacrifice himself to expose the fragility of control. Unbeknownst to the Imperium, this narrative was not accidental. It was the culmination of Valdor's great decision. The act that changed everything was not a battle or betrayal, but the deliberate creation of a myth. By allowing the narrative of the fallen king to spread, Valdor shifted the perception of rebellion itself. He transformed an isolated conflict into a parable of resistance against inevitability, embedding his story into the collective consciousness of those who heard it. In a galaxy ruled by the machinery of war, Valdor had wielded something far more insidious: the power of an idea. This decision marked the moment when Valdor fully embraced the persona of the King in Yellow. No longer content to serve as an observer, he had chosen to reshape the course of events through narrative rather than force. The story of the dethroned monarch became a symbol for those who questioned the Emperor's vision, drawing others into its orbit like moths to a flame. Valdor understood that direct defiance would be crushed by the sheer might of the Imperium, but a story could endure where armies could not. His words became a melody of ruin that lingered long after the battlefields had grown silent. The Emperor, upon learning of the events on the besieged world, recognized the influence of his former Captain General within the unfolding chaos. Though the details of their final exchange are shrouded in secrecy, it is believed that the Emperor foresaw the ripple effect of this act. Yet even with his immense foresight, he could not undo the consequences of Valdor's choice. By embedding his narrative within the hearts of the disillusioned, Valdor had created a wound that no weapon could mend, a fracture in the Imperium's perceived infallibility. The destruction of the world was swift and absolute. The remaining population was purged, the cities reduced to ash, and the name of the planet erased from Imperial records. But despite the thoroughness of the cleansing, the story had already spread. It was whispered in the shadows of hive cities, recited in secret gatherings, and written in fragmented passages across forbidden texts. The King in Yellow had shown that rebellion did not need armies to survive. It only needed a narrative that could not be silenced. In hindsight, this moment was not merely the fall of a king. It was the moment Valdor severed his final ties to the Emperor's truth. By choosing to frame the collapse of a world as an act of tragic defiance, he had rewritten the language of war itself. This was no longer a struggle for control of worlds and territories, but a contest of belief and perception. In doing so, Valdor cemented his place as an entity that existed outside the constraints of loyalty and duty, a figure who could not be defined by the roles he once played. Thus, the King in Yellow was no longer a title or a disguise. It was the culmination of a singular act of rebellion wrapped in myth. And as the Imperium tried to erase the traces of his influence, they unwittingly ensured its survival. Each attempt to purge his memory only deepened the enigma surrounding him, turning the story of the dethroned monarch into an unkillable legend. Valdor's choice had set the stage for a performance that would never truly end, for the power of a story is not in its conclusion, but in the echoes it leaves behind. The existence of the King in Yellow and the reverberations of his story created ripples far beyond the battlefield or the halls of Imperial command. His influence seeped into the cracks of the Imperium like a slow-moving poison, its presence felt not through direct confrontation, but through subtle transformations in belief, culture, and perception. The narrative of the fallen monarch, shrouded in sorrow, defiance, and fate, became more than a cautionary tale. It became a whisper carried on the winds of desperation, reaching the ears of those who questioned the inevitability of imperial rule. The immediate aftermath of his rise and the emperor's subsequent entombment within the Golden Throne created an unprecedented shift. The Imperium, a monolithic beacon of control, became fractured not only by external threats but also by doubt. For the first time in recorded history, the idea that the emperor himself had been brought low, regardless of the circumstances, undermined the myth of his invulnerability. Across hive cities, shrine worlds, and distant colonies, rumors spread of a figure whose very name had been struck from the records yet persisted in forbidden plays, symbols, and half-forgotten dreams. For the Imperium's leadership, this slow erosion of faith was far more dangerous than any external war. High-ranking officials of the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition devoted vast resources to suppressing the stories associated with the King in Yellow. Entire planets were placed under cultural lockdown, with artworks, writings, and relics seized and destroyed. However, the very act of suppression often deepened the mystery, lending the legend an allure that resistance movements began to adopt as a banner of rebellion. Cults emerged in secret, some driven by genuine reverence for the king, others by the allure of forbidden knowledge. The Inquisition, tasked with rooting out the taint of heresy, soon found itself overwhelmed by the spread of his legacy. These cells were not bound by the traditional rites of chaos worship, nor driven by promises of power or immortality. Instead, they gathered to speak verses from a play that defied linear interpretation, sharing fragments of what they called the unwritten script. Inquisitors who captured members of these cults found their prisoners maddeningly difficult to interrogate. Many spoke not with fear or defiance, but with quiet acceptance, as if they believed they were fulfilling roles scripted long ago. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed the Imperium's vast fleets to navigate the void, began to show strange fluctuations in some regions of space. Astropaths reported vivid dreams of a city under twin suns, its streets lined with crumbling marble arches draped in yellow cloth. Many awoke screaming or fell into catatonic states, unable to describe the nature of what they had seen. While officials dismissed these incidents as warp-related disturbances, those who studied the deeper implications began to fear that something far worse was happening, a distortion not of the physical galaxy, but of collective consciousness itself. Beyond the Imperium, alien civilizations too felt the echoes of this strange phenomenon. Among the Eldar, ancient seers sensed distortions in the skeins of fate, threads of prophecy tangled with an unfamiliar presence. Their warnings became more dire, predicting the rise of narratives that could not be unspun by their foresight alone. Some craft worlds became obsessed with deciphering the truth behind the King in Yellow, convinced that his influence represented a new kind of threat, neither demon nor god, but something altogether different. They feared that his existence was not confined to mortal interpretation, but represented a fundamental disruption in the psychic tides of reality. For the human mind, shaped as it was by millennia of imperial dogma, the very idea of narrative-based corruption was both terrifying and bewildering. Unlike chaos, which corrupted through promises of power, pleasure, or destruction, the King in Yellow's influence did not promise anything tangible. Instead, it rewrote the perceptions of those who encountered it, embedding itself as an idea, a virus that shifted allegiances, dulled loyalties, and replaced purpose with resignation. This was not a corruption of body or soul, but of belief itself. Entire planetary governors reported sudden declines in productivity and morale, not due to rebellion, but due to a pervasive sense of futility. Worlds once renowned for their staunch devotion to the Emperor became quiet, their leaders offering empty proclamations while their citizens drifted into states of melancholy. Though subtle, this change proved devastating. While fortresses and armies remained intact, the will to fight began to erode. On some war fronts, entire regiments laid down their arms, not out of cowardice but because they believed the stories. that they were merely characters fulfilling a doomed narrative. Even more alarming were the outbreaks of silent cities, where populations vanished seemingly overnight, leaving behind settlements eerily undisturbed. Investigators would find remnants of gatherings, tables set for plays that had no audience, stages built in abandoned temples, and scripts scrawled across walls in languages that defied translation. These occurrences were not localized. They spread across distant sectors, each report eerily similar despite vast distances separating the events. The Adeptus Mechanicus, known for its strict adherence to logic and protocol, found the influence of the King in Yellow particularly baffling. Machine spirits aboard Voidcraft began exhibiting strange behaviors, cycles of operation that aligned with cryptic patterns resembling lines of a play. Explorator fleets reported the appearance of ruinous cities on forgotten worlds, each bearing the hallmarks of ancient yet unknown architectures draped in symbols resembling crowns and masks. Some magi theorized that these were echoes of something more profound, an attempt by a malevolent intelligence to reshape human history by altering the very myths that defined it. The Imperium's response was brutal and unforgiving. Planets deemed too far gone were subject to exterminatus, their populations purged in the hopes of erasing the infection of doubt. But the sheer scale of the phenomenon defied containment. No matter how many worlds burned, the story persisted, carried by refugees and fragmented memories. With each attempt to erase it, the legend grew stronger, until it became a quiet yet undeniable part of the Imperium's undercurrent, a story that could not be unwritten. Thus, the existence of the King in Yellow altered the very fabric of the galaxy. His influence was not bound by time or place, but by the hearts and minds of those who, knowingly or unknowingly, accepted his narrative. Even as the Imperium continued its relentless crusade against external threats, it faced an enemy that could not be fought with bolters or faith alone. The King in Yellow's true weapon was not his presence, but the void he left in his wake, a reminder that some battles are not fought in the material realm, but within the fragile constructs of belief. And in the theater of fate, his performance was far from over. One of the most debated and haunting aspects of the King in Yellow within the Warhammer 40k universe is the pervasive nature of his influence and the medium through which it spreads, the enigmatic play that bears his name. This artifact, though existing in fragments across countless star systems, defies conventional classification. Unlike the grim tomes of the Black Library or the corrupted grimoires of chaos, the play is neither a summoning manual nor a scripture. Instead, it is an elaborate story that, when performed or read, seems to blur the lines between reality and fiction. The play itself is at the heart of many fan theories, largely due to its bizarre and contradictory nature. There is no definitive version, and every discovered manuscript appears slightly different. Some are complete scripts detailing acts, characters, and dialogues, while others consist of scattered lines, often written in a chaotic scrawl. Despite these differences, all versions share key motifs: references to a decaying city bathed in the light of twin suns, masked figures trapped in endless revelry, and a central figure cloaked in yellow robes who seems both savior and destroyer. Many interpretations argue that the play is not merely a text, but an evolving narrative that adapts based on the reader or performer, drawing them into its threads. What sets the King in Yellow apart from typical entities in Warhammer lore is the profound passivity of his influence. He does not call for violent devotion like the gods of chaos, nor offer tangible rewards to his followers. Instead, the play acts as a gateway to a slow unraveling of the self. It is said that those who read it do not immediately descend into madness, but are instead left with lingering questions and a sense of unease that grows with time. Over days, months, or even years, the seeds planted by the narrative take root. Dreams become more vivid, often filled with images of a golden mask or an unending spiral of steps leading nowhere. Waking moments begin to feel scripted, as though life itself has become a performance dictated by unseen hands. One of the more disturbing mysteries is whether the play was ever truly written in a conventional sense. Some theorists within the fan community propose that it is a psychic imprint, not created by mortal hands but woven directly into the warp as an echo of some catastrophic event. This would explain its erratic appearances across time and space, as well as why different versions seem to exist simultaneously, yet follow the same thematic patterns. The notion that the play is a manifestation of thought itself, born from a collective fear of fate and insignificance, aligns with the broader existential horror it evokes. A frequently discussed topic is the play's ability to bind the reader or audience to a specific role within its narrative. In some versions, readers claim to see their own likeness described within the text, as though they had become a character. This raises chilling questions about the nature of identity and free will. Are those who succumb to the King in Yellow merely victims of a sentient text, or were they always destined to become part of this tragic tale? Fan debates often spiral into discussions about fate and determinism, with some arguing that the play is a reflection of the Emperor's Great Crusade, a tragic performance in which humanity itself is cast as a doomed actor, bound to repeat the same mistakes. The visual symbolism associated with the King in Yellow is another compelling topic of analysis. The yellow robes, tattered yet regal, symbolize decay wrapped in majesty, a reminder that even beauty and grandeur can be corrupted by time and entropy. The pale, featureless mask often attributed to the figure is interpreted as a metaphor for the loss of self, an erasure of identity as the wearer becomes an instrument of the narrative. The mask's shifting nature in artistic depictions, sometimes a blank slate, other times a weeping visage, suggests that it reflects the emotions of those who gaze upon it, reinforcing the idea that the king mirrors the fears and desires of his observers. Some fan discussions delve into the potential connections between the King in Yellow and the imperial truth. The emperor's rejection of superstition and his insistence on a materialistic worldview created an ideological vacuum in which suppressed narratives could flourish. In the absence of spiritual belief, stories became a way for mortals to make sense of their place in an uncaring universe. This context makes the King in Yellow's rise particularly poignant. Unlike Chaos, which exploits unchecked emotion and ambition, the King's narrative capitalizes on humanity's need for meaning. The story does not terrify by spectacle alone. It insinuates that the very act of seeking purpose is a performance, with mortals playing roles they cannot escape. Another point of fascination is the relationship between the King in Yellow and memory. Survivors of encounters with his influence often report strange gaps in their recollection, as though entire sequences of events had been rewritten. Some fan theories suggest that the play itself rewrites history, subtly altering perceptions of reality until the audience becomes unsure of what was real and what was imagined. There are rumors in-universe apocryphal texts about planets that disappeared, not because they were destroyed, but because their stories were rewritten into oblivion. One of the most chilling theories posited by fan communities is the idea that the King in Yellow's influence could never be fully eradicated because it exists as long as sentient beings create stories. Any attempt to suppress or purge his tale only ensures that it will resurface in new forms, art, poetry, or even casual folklore. This aligns with observations that even unrelated planetary myths often feature motifs resembling those found in the play. Whether these myths arose independently or are echoes of a single malignant source remains an unsolved mystery. Ultimately, the King in Yellow's unique impact on the Warhammer 40k universe lies not in the armies he commands or the destruction he leaves in his wake, but in the profound philosophical and narrative implications of his presence. His story is not about conquest or annihilation, but about erosion of belief, identity, and the boundaries between fiction and reality. It is a tale that draws its strength from whispers rather than proclamations, from hidden meanings rather than open conflict. And for those who dare to delve too deeply into its pages, the question remains: Are they the reader, or have they always been part of the cast? The story of the King in Yellow is as much about the individuals drawn into his orbit as it is about his own transformation. Some served as catalysts for his rise, knowingly or unwittingly aiding in the unspooling of fate, while others stood against him with unwavering resolve. The interplay of loyalty, fear, and ambition created a stage upon which these figures played pivotal roles, shaping the outcome of events that would echo throughout the galaxy. One of the most enigmatic figures connected to the King in Yellow's ascent was an individual known only as the Chronicler. While their true identity remains debated among Imperial scholars and archivists, the Chronicler is said to have been a scribe within the early courts of the Emperor, a historian tasked with recording the rise of humanity. However, their fascination with narrative went beyond simple documentation. The Chronicler believed that stories, more than victories or decrees, shaped civilizations. This obsession led them to seek out forbidden knowledge, and it was through this pursuit that they crossed paths with Constantin Valdor in his later, more fractured state. The Chronicler became the first true herald of the King in Yellow's narrative, embedding subtle references to the play within historical accounts, war records, and victory oaths. They possessed a remarkable intellect and an unparalleled ability to manipulate language, weaving phrases that lingered in the subconscious minds of those who read them. Yet this gift was also their weakness. Consumed by their own belief that stories could reshape reality, the Chronicler became blind to the devastating consequences of their actions. What they viewed as a grand reimagining of humanity's destiny was, in truth, a slow descent into chaos. Their desire to shape history cost them their sanity, but not before they had sown the seeds of doubt and despair across countless worlds. On the opposite end of the spectrum stood Solara Trinath, an inquisitor of unwavering conviction. Born into the ecclesiarchy's heartlands, Solara's early life was marked by tragedy, a warp incursion that claimed her family and shattered her home world. This loss forged within her an unbreakable hatred for anything that threatened humanity's unity and faith. As a member of the Ordo Malleus, Solara was known for her relentless pursuit of those who trafficked in forbidden texts and whispered heresies. When rumors of the King in Yellow's resurgence began to surface, she was among the first to recognize the potential scale of the threat. Solara's strength lay in her unshakable willpower and ability to inspire loyalty in her allies. Her speeches were said to reignite the flame of faith even in the most battle-weary troops. However, her greatest weakness was her refusal to acknowledge subtlety as a form of warfare. To her, all enemies of the Imperium were to be met with fire and steel, and she viewed psychological warfare as a tool of cowards. This rigid approach proved to be her downfall. When faced with the King in Yellow's narratives, which spread like shadows rather than armies, her traditional methods faltered. Though she led purges that razed entire cities suspected of harboring cultists, the story survived in whispers, leaving her victories hollow. Among those who acted as intermediaries in the King's rise was Ralos Draven, a rogue trader who operated far beyond the Imperium's traditional boundaries. Known for his resourcefulness and greed, Draven had made his fortune scavenging relics from dead worlds and dealing in forbidden knowledge. His reputation as a fearless opportunist made him the perfect candidate for those seeking objects of power and meaning. It was Draven who first smuggled copies of the accursed play between sectors, seeing them not as harbingers of doom, but as curiosities for the wealthy and bored. He viewed the legend of the King in Yellow as an amusing fiction that could be exploited for profit. Yet even Draven was not immune to the pull of the narrative he helped spread. Though initially driven by greed, he became entranced by the story surrounding the King's court, convincing himself that he could become more than a merchant. He could be a figure of destiny, part of a cosmic performance that elevated mortals beyond their limited roles. This fatal hubris led him to his demise. When Draven finally encountered one of the King's emissaries in the flesh, he was not granted the recognition he sought. Instead, he was silenced, his story reduced to a cautionary tale for others who dared to meddle with what they could not understand. In contrast, there was Taryn Vel, an exiled scholar of the Navis nobility who devoted her life to understanding the mechanics of fate and chance. She became an unexpected adversary of the King in Yellow, though not through faith or military might. Taryn's approach was rooted in logic and an innate understanding of how narratives shape reality. She believed that if the King in Yellow's influence spread through stories, then counter-stories, alternative narratives, could serve as a shield against his corruption. Taryn traveled across war-torn systems, gathering remnants of pre-imperial myths and crafting new tales that celebrated resilience and defiance. Her strength was her ability to reframe despair as a form of rebellion, giving soldiers and civilians alike a new perspective that rejected fatalism. However, her mission was a lonely one. Taryn's intellectual approach made her an outsider among both the Inquisition and the military. Many dismissed her as a dreamer playing with words while the Imperium burned. Yet, for those who heard her speak, there was no denying the power of her stories. They did not banish the King's influence entirely, but they gave those who listened a brief moment of clarity, enough to resist if only for a time. Finally, there was the figure known as the Unnamed Herald, a faceless entity whose existence remains shrouded in doubt and speculation. Some describe the Herald as a physical manifestation of the King's will, while others believe it was once a mortal corrupted into becoming the King's mouthpiece. Unlike traditional cult leaders or prophets, the Herald did not rally followers with sermons or promises. Instead, its presence was enough to unravel the minds of those who encountered it. Witnesses spoke of a being wrapped in robes of pale gold, its voice devoid of inflection, as though reading lines from a script written by someone else. The Herald's greatest strength was its ability to amplify the King's narrative, turning whispers into shouts and pushing fractured minds into complete surrender. In every legend, there are those who rise to prominence not because of their strength or virtue, but because of their place in the story. The tale of the King in Yellow is no exception. Whether through ambition, loyalty, or hubris, these figures became part of a performance that transcended mortal understanding, shaping the galaxy in ways that no war or decree could match. And as their stories intertwined, one question remained. Had they ever had the power to change the narrative, or had they merely fulfilled roles written long before they took the stage? The legend of the King in Yellow is steeped in mysteries that defy concrete explanation, and the theories that surround him have sparked fierce debates across the galaxy and within the Warhammer 40k fan community. Some questions stem from ancient, fragmented records, while others arise from the seemingly impossible nature of his influence. Despite centuries of inquiry, the truth remains obscured by shadows and unreliable accounts, fueling speculation that continues to haunt even the most rational minds. One of the most pressing questions is the true origin of the play itself. Was it truly written by mortal hands, or is it a manifestation of a larger, more cosmic phenomenon? Some argue that the play was crafted by Valdor after his transformation, intended as a reflection of his internal unraveling. Others believe that it predated him entirely, an echo of a long-dead civilization whose fate mirrors the downfall it prophesies. This theory suggests that the play is a recursive cycle, a story that has repeated itself countless times, latching on to different worlds and peoples as its actors across the eons. If true, this raises disturbing questions. Is Valdor merely the latest incarnation of a role that must always exist? And if so, who wrote the script to begin with? A closely related mystery revolves around the role of the Emperor himself in these events. While many accounts paint the Emperor as an omniscient strategist, the fact that Valdor's transformation and the subsequent emergence of the King in Yellow were not prevented has led some to question whether the Emperor was truly blind to the threat, or whether he allowed these events to unfold for reasons known only to him. Some radical theories propose that the Emperor's early interactions with Valdor may have involved experiments with fate and narrative manipulation, attempts to shape human belief on a scale so grand that it blurred the line between guidance and control. These theorists argue that the Emperor may have inadvertently set the stage for Valdor's descent by seeking to create a perfect story of unity and purpose, only for it to spiral into tragedy. Another point of contention is the exact nature of the King in Yellow's influence. Unlike the Chaos Gods, whose corrupting touch is relatively well understood, the King operates on an entirely different level. Theories abound regarding whether his presence represents a new kind of warp entity or something altogether unique. Some believe he exists outside the Imperium entirely, a sentient fragment of reality's underlying narrative framework, a force not of chaos or order, but of inevitability. If true, this would suggest that the Imperium's understanding of the warp is incomplete, and that other entities, shaped by concepts beyond the known pantheon, may also exist. Others claim that the King is a metaparasite, a being that survives by embedding itself in belief systems and cultural myths, feeding not on souls but on attention and recognition. The question of his endgame is perhaps the most perplexing mystery of all. Unlike other powerful entities, the King in Yellow does not seek outright destruction or domination. His influence leads to despair and submission, but there is no evidence that he desires the complete annihilation of his audience. Instead, his narrative seems to guide entire civilizations toward entropy and ruin, as though their downfall serves a greater cosmic purpose. This has led to the chilling hypothesis that the King's goal is not conquest but conclusion, an attempt to close the book on reality itself. Proponents of this theory believe that the King's final act would be the unraveling of all stories, leaving behind a void where even memory and history are erased. Theories regarding his relationship with the Chaos Gods also fuel intense debate. Some argue that he is an independent force, separate from the pantheon of the warp. Others, however, believe that his existence aligns with the domain of chaos undivided, a manifestation of despair that transcends the individual aspects of hatred, lust, ambition, and decay. These theorists point to his narrative focus and the psychological corruption he spreads as evidence that he is an unacknowledged aspect of chaos, perhaps even a precursor to the warp's current state. The idea that the King in Yellow might represent an older, purer form of chaos, one that predates mortal interpretations, has led to frantic attempts by the Ordo Malleus to gather further evidence, though what they have uncovered remains tightly guarded. Another fascinating question is the nature of the City of Twin Suns often referenced in the play. Descriptions of this location vary wildly between manuscripts, but certain key features remain consistent: crumbling spires, an endless sky divided by two dying stars, and a river that never reaches its destination. Some scholars theorize that this city represents the metaphysical heart of the King's domain, a place where all who succumb to his influence are drawn, forever trapped within an unending narrative. Others propose that the city is symbolic rather than literal, a representation of the collapse of civilizations consumed by doubt and inevitability. Still, a more terrifying interpretation posits that the city is a real place hidden somewhere in the galaxy, awaiting rediscovery. If true, the implications would be dire. Finding the city could trigger the final act of the King's story, ushering in an event that may rewrite the galaxy's fate. Finally, one of the most debated topics is the supposed inevitability of the King in Yellow's return. While many believe that his influence has waned since the Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne, others argue that his absence is only temporary. Some point to recurring patterns in human history, cycles of rise, stagnation, and collapse, as evidence that his narrative has not ended, but is merely waiting for the next stage to begin. If the King in Yellow is truly a force that thrives on the despair of doomed civilizations, then the Imperium's slow decay, with its endless wars and unrelenting bureaucracy, may be the perfect stage for his return. The question is not whether he will rise again, but when and what form his story will take. In the end, the mysteries surrounding the King in Yellow are as vast as they are unsettling. Every attempt to unravel his nature only deepens the enigma, as though the act of questioning itself draws the inquisitive mind deeper into his narrative. For every revelation, there are new uncertainties, and the further one peers into the myth, the more it seems to peer back. Whether he is an ancient anomaly, a cosmic inevitability, or a tragic product of the Emperor's most trusted companion, the King in Yellow's story remains unfinished, a haunting reminder that some tales are never truly over. The legacy of the King in Yellow's narrative casts a long shadow over the galaxy, shaping not just the past and present, but also the uncertain future of humanity and its fragile grip on survival. His story lingers in the cracks of imperial doctrine and seeps into the consciousness of generations who will never know his name, but will feel the weight of his influence. The question that hangs over the Imperium like a storm cloud is whether this influence represents an inevitable tragedy or an opportunity to confront the unseen forces that shape existence. One of the potential long-term consequences of the King in Yellow's legacy is the slow erosion of belief in the Imperium's infallibility. While faith in the Emperor as a godlike protector remains strong among the masses, the emergence of stories that suggest even the Emperor's chosen could falter raises unsettling doubts. This ideological vulnerability could either fragment the Imperium or strengthen it, depending on how its leaders choose to respond. If they continue to suppress any mention of the King in Yellow through fear and eradication, the legend will persist in the shadows, mutating and spreading as a whispered truth. Alternatively, some radical thinkers suggest that acknowledging the fallibility of even the most loyal figures could foster a new kind of resilience, one based not on blind faith, but on self-awareness and the ability to confront flaws head-on. In the longer term, the subtle presence of the King in Yellow also raises questions about the very nature of power within the Imperium. The notion that belief and perception can shape reality hints at a vulnerability that extends beyond the material realm. If narratives themselves can become weapons capable of altering the course of history, then the Imperium's reliance on physical force may no longer be sufficient. This realization could lead to a new era of warfare, one where controlling stories, symbols, and cultural myths becomes as crucial as commanding fleets and armies. However, such a shift would bring its own dangers. The manipulation of narratives on such a scale could blur the lines between truth and propaganda, creating a galaxy where reality itself becomes subjective. For those who study the warp, the King in Yellow's influence suggests an even graver possibility, that humanity's collective consciousness is susceptible to forces that do not fit neatly within the established framework of chaos. If the King in Yellow represents an entity that exists outside the traditional pantheon of the Immaterium, then other, similarly obscure forces may also exist. This realization could trigger a paradigm shift in the study of the warp, forcing the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Adeptus Mechanicus to re-examine their understanding of reality's boundaries. Such revelations, however, come at a great cost. Those who delve too deeply into the unknown risk becoming ensnared in the very stories they seek to understand. Another possible outcome of the King in Yellow's continued influence is the spread of fatalism within the Imperium. The idea that one's fate is preordained, scripted by some unseen force, could sap the resolve of entire sectors. This cultural shift would weaken the Imperium's ability to wage war on its countless enemies. However, not all interpretations of his narrative are entirely bleak. Some see the story of the King in Yellow as a cautionary tale, warning against the dangers of complacency and blind obedience. If framed correctly, this interpretation could serve as a rallying point for reformists who believe that the Imperium's stagnation and oppressive rigidity make it vulnerable to narratives of despair. There is also the unsettling possibility that the King in Yellow's presence could be amplified by external factors. The warp's instability, intensified by the Great Rift, could act as a magnifying glass for his narrative, allowing it to spread more rapidly through the psychic fabric of the galaxy. If astropathic communications continue to be plagued by visions of twin suns and masked figures, entire fleets could become lost in the tides of uncertainty. This would make galactic coordination even more difficult and further isolate vulnerable worlds from reinforcement. Conversely, the rising awareness of narrative-based corruption could lead to new defensive measures, such as training psychers and commanders to recognize and resist the influence of malignant stories before they take root. One of the more controversial theories among scholars is that the King in Yellow's narrative could eventually challenge the power of the Chaos Gods themselves. Unlike the Pantheon of Chaos, which thrives on raw emotion, the King's influence operates on a subtler plane, reshaping belief rather than fueling it with excess. If the King represents a new paradigm of corruption, one based on inevitability rather than temptation, it is possible that his return in full force could destabilize the balance of power within the warp. Some radical sects even suggest that if humanity were to embrace the narrative fully, they could reshape it into a weapon against chaos itself, turning the idea of futility into a path of defiance. However, this approach carries immense risks, as tampering with the fabric of belief could easily spiral into a new form of damnation. The potential consequences of the King in Yellow's resurgence extend beyond humanity. Alien civilizations such as the Eldar, who are intimately familiar with the dangers of prophecy, have already begun to interpret his narrative as a harbinger of a deeper unraveling. Some Eldar seers fear that the King's story may intersect with their own doomed fate, accelerating the final extinction of their kind. This fear could either fracture their already fragile alliances or drive them to make unprecedented decisions, such as seeking cooperation with the Imperium or even pursuing dangerous pacts in an attempt to alter fate. Similarly, the Tau, with their focus on unity and progress, may find themselves particularly vulnerable to the King's narrative, as it directly opposes their vision of a rational, ordered future. Ultimately, whether the King in Yellow's story serves as a warning or an inevitable end depends on how it is understood. If humanity continues to view him as an unknowable horror, his influence will remain a source of fear and despair. But if his story is reframed as a lesson in resilience, a reminder that even the most powerful can falter, yet survive, the Imperium may yet find strength in its darkest hour. However, such a transformation in perception requires a level of introspection that the Imperium has long resisted. In this fragile balance between destruction and renewal lies the true significance of the King in Yellow's tale. His story is a reminder that power does not reside solely in weapons or fortresses, but in the narratives that define existence. Whether the Imperium's future is shaped by tragedy or triumph may ultimately depend not on the strength of its fleets, but on the strength of its story, one written not by fate alone, but by those willing to defy the script.